Ever notice how some moments in history are like that first domino that just sets off a whole chain reaction?
Yeah.
Well, today we're taking a deep dive into one of those moments, the Battle of Great Bridge in Virginia,
Okay.
December 9th, 1775. Now, you might not think a battle at a bridge sounds all that earth-shattering,
Right.
but it really set off some shockwaves in those early days of the Revolutionary
It
War.
did. I think it's really interesting when we think about the Revolution, we often jump to those big battles up north.
Right. Lexington and Concord.
Exactly. But what was happening down in Virginia in the South was just as important in shaping how things eventually played out.
And Virginia was a powder keg at the time.
It was.
Early 1775, just like Massachusetts, you have this real standoff.
Mm.
Royal Governor Lord Dunmore, representing the British Crown,
Mm-hmm.
versus those colonial leaders who were pushing for, more and more autonomy.
Right.
And both sides were really locked in this struggle for control,
Yeah.
especially when it came to military supplies.
Absolutely. It was a pressure cooker. Dunmore trying to hold on to power for the crown.
Right.
The colonists increasingly resisting that control.
Right.
And this fight over supplies really became a flashpoint.
It did. And this is where Norfolk comes in,
Okay.
the focus of our deep dive today.
Mhm.
Now, Norfolk was a real hotbed of Loyalist support.
It was.
And as things got more and more tense, Dunmore actually had to escape there for safety. He ends up operating from a Royal Navy ship
Wow.
to really strengthen his position and the area around Norfolk.
Mhm.
He fortifies this place called the Great Bridge,
Okay.
and it was a crucial river crossing south of Norfolk.
It's interesting when you think about the geography of that location. The Great Bridge crosses the southern branch of the Elizabeth River,
Right.
and it was the main land route if you were going south from Norfolk.
Okay.
And with the Great Dismal Swamp right there on the edge,
Oh, wow.
the only way to the bridge was by these narrow causeways. So naturally, it was a very strong defensive spot.
It sounds like it. So our mission today, and thanks for joining us on this,
Of course.
is to really dig into why this battle, the Battle of Great Bridge. It might not be as famous as some of those big battles everyone knows,
Right.
but it was absolutely critical in those early stages of the war in Virginia. And luckily, we've got some great accounts that detail everything. We've got the lead up, we've got the actual battle,
Yeah.
and then we've got the after effects, both immediate and long-term.
And those long-term consequences were really significant. This wasn't just a small fight.
Right.
This was a real turning point.
Mm-hmm.
It essentially ended British control of Virginia much earlier than in some other colonies.
Wow. Okay, let's get into it. Let's start with the background.
Sure.
We talked about the rising tensions.
Huh?
What was happening in Virginia connect to those very famous events up north?
Yeah.
Lexington conquered.
Well, the timing is key. The battles of Lexington and Concord, April 1775, they really were the spark.
Yeah.
And they ignited similar feelings all over the colonies. Virginia was no different. Just like in Massachusetts, Virginians started forming their own militias,
Right.
organizing themselves completely outside of royal control.
Right.
And naturally, this led to conflict with Governor Dunmore,
Right.
as he was trying to assert that British control.
Right. And Dunmore himself took some pretty big steps that really added fuel to the fire.
He did.
Didn't he? I remember reading about his attempts to get his hands on military supplies.
Yeah.
What did he do that really escalated things beyond just that general unrest?
Well, one early move that really riled up the colonists was in April 1775. He ordered all the gunpowder removed from the public magazine in Williamsburg.
Oh,
Now, no shots were fired during that specific incident,
okay.
but it showed how deeply he distrusted those colonial militias.
Right.
And it really galvanized that growing rebel movement. Dunmore himself started to feel less and less safe in Williamsburg,
Okay.
so he actually ends up retreating to those Royal Navy ships near Norfolk in June 1775, seeking their protection.
So that brings us right back to Norfolk and its Loyalist leanings.
Yeah.
It sounds like that gave Dunmore a pretty crucial base of operations.
It did. Norfolk had very strong commercial ties to Britain,
Okay.
and a lot of the merchants there, they were nervous about this growing rebellion.
Right.
And the British fleet, being right there in the harbor, probably discouraged a lot of people in the town from openly supporting the Patriots.
Right.
So for Dunmore, Norfolk seemed like a pretty safe place, a place where he could try to reestablish British dominance.
Okay. But he wasn't just relying on the British troops that were already there, was he?
No, he wasn't.
He started recruiting. And this is where things get really interesting,
They do.
particularly with the formation of the Ethiopian regiment.
Yes.
What was the thinking behind that, and what impact did it have?
Well, this is what's so fascinating and complex about Dunmore's actions in November 1775.
Okay.
Some would even say he was getting desperate.
Right.
He issues a proclamation offering freedom to enslaved people if they were willing to fight for the British.
Oh, wow.
This directly led to the creation of the Ethiopian regiment made up of formerly enslaved men.
Wow.
He also raised another Loyalist unit called the Queen's Own Loyal Virginia Regiment.
That must have sent shockwaves through Virginia.
It did.
No matter what side you were on. I mean, the idea of armed, formerly enslaved people, that was a direct and terrifying threat to the entire social and economic order
Absolutely.
that was built on slavery.
Right.
What was the reaction from both sides?
Well, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
It caused massive alarm among both Patriot and Loyalist slaveholders,
Right.
even those Loyalists who supported the crown in theory.
Yeah.
The idea of losing their slaves and the potential for chaos and upheaval,
Right.
that was just deeply unsettling.
Yeah.
For the Patriots, this just proved what they already believed about British tyranny.
Mm-hmm.
It was a direct attack on their way of life.
Right.
And it really made them even more determined to resist.
It sounds like Dunmore, despite all the chaos he was causing, was actually pretty optimistic about getting things back under control.
He was.
I think there's even a quote where he says he thinks he can have the colony back in line by late November 1775.
He did.
What made him so confident?
It seems like those early recruiting successes he had, at least in terms of sheer numbers,
Yeah.
gave him a bit of a false sense of security.
Okay.
He wrote that he thought he could reduce this colony to a proper sense of their duty pretty quickly.
Wow.
And this overconfidence probably stemming from his belief in his military strength
Mm-hmm. Right.
and that loyalist support in Norfolk.
Right.
It really seems to have led to some bad decisions later on. Miscalculations, really.
Okay. So that brings us to the Great Bridge, this strategically crucial location we've talked about as natural defenses.
Yes.
How did Dunmore use that geography to his advantage to fortify it?
Well, knowing how important the bridge was as the main way to get south from Norfolk, Dunmore sent a detachment of the 14th Regiment of Foot.
Okay.
That's a regular British Army unit.
Right.
To build a small but fortified stockade on the Norfolk side of the bridge.
Okay.
They called it Fort Murray.
Fort Murray.
And they did something very practical.
Okay.
They removed the planks from the middle of the bridge.
Oh, wow.
So it would be really hard for anyone to just advance across.
So this wasn't just some quickly thrown together barricade, was it?
No, it wasn't.
Fort Murray had some serious firepower, didn't it?
It did. Fort Murray was equipped with 2 cannons
Okay.
and a bunch of smaller swivel guns,
Mm-hmm.
which gave the British a major advantage in terms of firepower.
Okay.
The initial garrison was about 40 to 80 men,
Oh, okay.
a mix of regulars from the 14th Foot,
Right.
along with some smaller groups from the Ethiopian Regiment and the Queen's Own Loyal Virginia Regiment.
So the Patriots couldn't just waltz across that bridge.
No.
They were facing a fortified position
Yeah,
with artillery.
that's right.
What was their response to this growing British presence at the Great Bridge?
Well, the Virginia Assembly was actively responding to what Dunmore was doing.
Right.
They ordered their militia to march on Norfolk to counter him.
Right.
Colonel William Woodford,
Mm-hmm.
who was in charge of the 2nd Virginia Regiment,
Right.
was the first to reach Great Bridge
Okay.
around December 2nd.
Okay.
His force, which included his regiment and a company of expert riflemen from the Culpeper Minutemen,
Okay.
numbered about 500 men.
That's a decent-sized force.
It is. And they set up camp right across the bridge from Fort Murray.
Okay. But even with a larger force at first,
Mm-hmm.
Woodford hesitated to attack.
He did.
What was he worried about?
Well, he was understandably cautious
Yeah.
when he saw those British fortifications at Fort Murray.
Right.
And he also thought the British garrison was bigger than it actually was.
Okay.
And crucially, his forces didn't have any artillery that could match those cannons in the fort.
Right. Makes sense.
So instead of risking a frontal assault,
Yeah.
he decided to dig in, secure their side of the bridge, and prevent any British advances.
So smart move.
Yeah,
But the Patriot forces kept growing right.
they did.
It wasn't just Woodford's initial arrival.
No.
Where were these reinforcements coming from?
Well, as word of the standoff at Great Bridge spread,
Mm-hmm.
more militia companies started showing up from nearby counties in Virginia
Okay.
and even from North Carolina.
Oh, wow.
By December 8th, they had almost 900 men,
Wow.
and over 700 of those were ready to fight.
That's a big difference.
Yeah. There was also a moment of hope when some cannons arrived with the North Carolina troops.
Oh, great.
But it turned out they couldn't use them.
Why? What was wrong with them?
They didn't have the mounts and carriages they needed to actually fire them.
Oh, what a bummer.
It was.
And I remember reading something about rumors of Scottish Highlanders joining Dunmore's forces.
Yeah.
That must have really worried the Patriots.
Yeah, it did. Those rumors definitely added to the tension.
Yeah.
And probably played a role in Woodford's initial hesitation.
Right.
In reality, there were about 120 Scottish families who had arrived in the area,
Okay.
but hardly any of the men were trained or equipped for battle.
Okay.
But the idea that Dunmore might have experienced fighters coming in
Yeah.
would have been a big concern for Woodford.
Makes sense. So you have this tense standoff, fortified British on one side,
Right.
growing but cautious Patriot force on the other.
Yeah.
What finally breaks the stalemate and leads to the battle itself on December 9th?
Well, it seems Dunmore got some bad intel.
Okay.
Someone told him that the colonial militia now had cannons that actually worked.
Also, he thought they'd gotten those cannons fixed.
Right. And this perceived threat to Fort Murray made him decide to attack first.
Okay.
His plan was to have the Ethiopian regiment companies attack downriver as a diversion.
Okay, to distract them.
Exactly. To draw the militia's attention away from the bridge. And then, at the same time, the main British force, with reinforcements from Norfolk,
Right.
would launch an attack across the bridge early in the morning.
Okay, a coordinated attack. But that diversionary attack by the Ethiopian regiment, that never happened, did it?
It didn't.
What went wrong?
Well, the Ethiopian regiment detachment that was supposed to do the diversion,
Yeah.
they had been sent on a routine deployment the day before,
Okay.
and Dunmore, it seems, just didn't make sure they were back in time for the attack.
Oh, so a miscommunication.
It seems like it.
Wow.
But even though the crucial diversion was missing, Captain Samuel Leslie, who had brought those reinforcements to Fort Murray during the night,
Okay.
he decided to go ahead with the attack anyway, around dawn, on December 9th.
So the British basically launch a frontal assault across a bridge that's still partially dismantled
Yeah.
against an enemy that's dug in. And they do it without their planned distraction.
They do.
That seems like a really bad move tactically.
It was a big mistake. First, Leslie's men had to put the planks back on the bridge.
Okay.
Under potential enemy fire.
Yeah.
Once that was done, Captain Charles Fordyce
Okay.
led a company of about 60 grenadiers.
Right.
Those were usually the elite assault troops
Right.
across the bridge.
Okay.
They immediately ran into the Patriot sentries and the alarm was raised.
Okay.
Right behind them was a company of Navy gunners
Okay.
who were supposed to man the cannons they brought with them.
So the Patriots, they were ready for this, weren't they?
They were.
What did they do?
At first, the militia in their camp.
Yeah.
They thought the early morning fighting was just the usual back and forth,
Okay.
but they quickly realized this was a full-blown British attack.
Oh, wow.
A company of about 60 Patriot militiamen were in defensive positions
Okay.
behind those earthworks they had built. They held their fire, waiting until the British grenadiers were incredibly close,
How close?
about 50 yards.
50 yards.
And then they unleashed a devastating volley of musket fire.
50 yards. That's point-blank range.
It is.
What kind of impact would that have had on the British?
Oh, it would have been brutal.
Yeah.
Instantaneous. Captain Fordyce, who was leading the charge.
Yeah.
He was killed almost instantly.
Oh,
Along with many of the men at the front,
right.
the British advance just completely stopped.
Right.
They lost all momentum.
Wow.
It's estimated that about half of Fordyce's men were either killed or wounded in that first volley.
Wow. What about the Navy gunners?
Yeah,
They were supposed to be providing cover fire, weren't they?
there were.
Were they effective at all?
Their cannons had basically no effect on the Patriot earthworks.
Okay.
Those earthworks provided a lot of protection.
Right.
Meanwhile, Colonel Woodford was quickly organizing the rest of the militia
Okay.
and moving them forward to reinforce those initial defenders.
Smart.
He also very cleverly positioned the riflemen from the Culpeper Minutemen on their left flank, because those rifles had much better range and accuracy
Right.
than the regular muskets.
So those rifles must have made a big difference,
They did.
especially in such an open position.
Yes. The Minutemen's long-range fire started targeting the British on the other side of the bridge,
Okay.
putting those Navy gunners under real pressure.
Right.
They were the only ones who could fire back at that distance,
Right.
faced with that accurate fire and the advancing Patriot militia. the Navy gunners decided to spike their cannons,
Okay.
which meant they couldn't be used.
Right.
So the Patriots wouldn't get them.
Right.
And then they retreated back across the bridge. At that point, Captain Leslie, seeing things falling apart,
Yeah.
he ordered his remaining troops to pull back to the relative safety of Fort Murray.
Okay.
The whole main fight lasted only about 25 minutes.
25 minutes that really changed the course of the war in Virginia.
Yeah.
What were the immediate consequences of this Patriot victory?
Well, after a short truce to let the British collect their dead and wounded,
Okay.
and during that truce, the Patriots actually buried Captain Fordyce with full military honors
Oh, wow.
near the battlefield.
That's interesting. Yeah. Showing respect for the enemy.
Yeah.
Okay.
The remaining Loyalist forces quietly retreated back to Norfolk under the cover of darkness that night.
Okay.
Now, the numbers of casualties are a little different depending on the account you read.
Okay.
Dunmore reported 62 British killed or wounded.
Okay.
A Patriot account claimed as many as 102 British losses.
Okay.
But, remarkably, the only reported Patriot casualty was one man who got a slight wound to his hand.
Wow. That's a huge difference in casualties.
It is.
It really shows how effective the Patriots were.
It does.
Dug in like that with that accurate fire.
Yeah. Colonel Woodford himself,
Mm-hmm.
in his report on the battle, he called it a second Bunker's Hill affair in miniature.
Wow.
He was clearly proud of how they had held their ground against that determined British attack.
Yeah.
And the Virginia militia was soon bolstered even more by the arrival of more troops from North Carolina,
Okay.
this time led by Colonel Robert Howe,
Right.
really cementing Patriot control of the region. Dunmore unsurprisingly blamed the defeat on Captain Leslie
Right.
for attacking without waiting for the diversion.
Okay. So Dunmore and his Loyalist supporters were in a very tough spot now.
Yeah, they were.
What do they do?
They fled to the Royal Navy ships anchored off the coast
Okay.
and left Norfolk to the victorious Patriot forces.
Wow. But even though he was stuck on those ships,
Yeah,
General George Washington realized that Dunmore was still a threat.
he did.
Yeah.
He actually warned that if Dunmore wasn't crushed before spring, he could become the most formidable enemy America has in that part of the country.
Wow. Strong words.
They were.
And the situation just kept getting more tense, especially when it came to supplies for those overcrowded British ships.
Right.
And this ultimately led to the destruction of Norfolk, didn't it?
It did. After a series of escalating arguments over supplies for the British fleet,
Mm-hmm.
Dunmore, along with Commodore Henry Pellow, made the decision to bombard Norfolk.
Wow.
On January 1st, 1776,
Okay.
the Royal Navy ships started shelling the town,
Oh, wow.
and then the Patriot troops finished the destruction,
Wow.
looting and burning what was left of that former Loyalist stronghold.
A dramatic end for what had been a key center of Loyalist support.
It was.
But Dunmore wasn't quite done in the region, was he?
No, he wasn't. He tried to set up another base.
Okay.
In February 1776,
Mm-hmm.
Dunmore occupied Portsmouth
Okay.
and used it as a base to launch more raids throughout the Chesapeake Bay.
Oh, wow.
But it didn't work out for him. He was forced back to his fleet in late March
Yeah.
when General Charles Lee arrived with more Patriot forces.
Okay.
After a few more months of raiding up and down the Virginia coast,
Yeah.
Dunmore and the British fleet finally left Virginia for good.
Okay.
They sailed to New York City in August 1776, and he never came back.
So it really does seem like the Battle of Great Bridge marked a turning point.
It does.
It effectively ended British control in Virginia.
Yeah.
It's amazing how such a short local battle could have such a lasting impact.
It is, and it's important to remember that the site of this victory has been recognized,
Okay.
and people have tried to preserve it over the years.
Great.
There's a historical highway marker from 1934,
What?
and more recently, local citizens and organizations like the American Battlefield Trust
Mm-hmm.
have worked to protect and preserve the area for future generations.
It's great to hear.
Hmm.
Okay, so let's wrap things up. What's the main takeaway from our deep dive into the Battle of Great Bridge? What's the essential thing we should remember?
I think the key takeaway is this. The Battle of Great Bridge may not be as famous as some of those big Revolutionary War battles,
Right.
but it was a crucial early victory for the Patriots in Virginia.
It was.
It really broke British power in the colony,
Right.
forced Lord Dunmore to leave permanently, and really helped advance the cause of independence in the region.
So anyone listening now understands why this seemingly smaller battle was so important.
They do.
It wasn't just a minor skirmish.
No.
It was a vital step on Virginia's road to independence.
Absolutely. And I think it shows how those local conflicts, when they're driven by bigger ideas and strategic importance, can have a huge impact on the course of history.
Yeah.
A ripple effect.
It really makes you think how many other seemingly small local fights throughout history have changed things in ways we don't even realize.
Yeah.
What other small battles might have been just as important in shaking the world we live in today?
It's a great question.
It's definitely something to think about as you keep learning about the American Revolution.
It is.
And the experiences of all the people who were caught up in that incredible time.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.